Okay, welcome everyone. We have a lot that we're trying to cover today, so we can go ahead and get started. My name is Alex Budd, he and him pronouns, and I'm the Alliance organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Today, I'm speaking to you all from the homelands of the Debab and Quilcene Tuana peoples, as well as the Chimicum. As in many places, while the dominant histories and narratives have declared the indigenous communities of these lands extinct or gone, making our occupation of their lands feel more palatable. The Chimicum people are still here, and this summer they're building a longhouse for the first time since doing so was made illegal by the U.S. government in 1910. There's a lot we can learn, of course, from the first stewards of these lands in terms of how to be in balance and reciprocity with the forests, but also how to preserve and cultivate resilience in the face of violent and ruthless government uh, repression, which feels like something in this moment we can be learning more of and finding ways to tap into and cultivate as communities. So, um, so I wanted to just give a little bit of context. I think folks know that this is the first in a series of webinars about many of the major shifts happening in federal forest policy. As we're 6 months now into the new Trump administration. There's so much happening, lots of major changes to the legal and regulatory landscape, and there's huge implications with all this for forests and our work to protect them. It can be hard to track and understand all the details of what these new policies will mean on the ground. And that's why we're doing this series to try and break it down. There's so many things that not only is keeping track of them hard, but also understanding the bigger picture. Um, and that this is more than just a shift in priorities that comes with the new administration. It's the ground beneath our feet is shifting, and many of the tools and strategies and maps we've had for navigating that and protecting forests, wait a sec, are being shredded. So with this series, we're aiming. No, just a minute. So with this series, we're aiming to put the individual policy changes into a larger context, so we can, because we can't figure out how to move forward effectively without understanding the new lay of the land and the extent to which we'll need to figure out new strategies and tools. So tonight, we're focusing on, well, roughly focusing on congressional policy, specifically the Fix Our Forest Act and the budget reconciliation bill that just passed. And then the following webinars, which we'll be announcing shortly to everyone who signed up for this one, are going to focus on executive branch actions and also the implications of recent Supreme Court rulings. So just to briefly introduce our speakers tonight, really excited to have Lauren Anderson, the Climate Forest Program Manager with Oregon Wild, Leah Brewster, the Conservation Campaign Strategist with Sierra Club, and Katie Bilodeau, Staff Attorney with Wilderness Watch. Just a quick note, please drop your questions in the chat as they come up. We're going to be a little bit more conversational tonight and less presentation-y to some extent than sometimes webinars are. So please just, if you have a question, drop it in the chat and we'll try and address it in real time. But we'll also be able to follow up with anyone who doesn't get their question answered after the webinar. I think that's it. And Lauren, I'll hand it off to you to take us away.
Thanks, Alex. All right, we have a slide deck that we're gonna go through tonight. And Leah is kind enough to switch through those for us. So it's been a crazy few weeks, and it is definitely hard to keep track of everything that's been going on. There's been a lot of bad stuff happening, so we're going to give you guys an overview of a few different pieces of that, and try and end with a hopeful note as well of ways that you can take action and get engaged. Next slide. So this presentation is mostly focused on the bad forest stuff that was in the recently passed budget bill. And we're also going to touch on the Fix Our Forest Act, but it's good to have some context for just how crazy the current administration is. So I'm going to kick things off with a quick overview of Trump's logging executive orders as well, because having that context as we think through the legislation that has passed and may potentially pass is going to be very helpful to understand where we're headed. I'm also going to touch on the state of the federal agencies and what privatizing public lands can look like. Next slide. So there were two executive orders. The first executive order frames logging as the primary purpose of federal forest management. It frames increasing timber production as a matter of national and economic security. and it aims to reverse any federal policies that have prevented the ability to fully exploit our domestic timber supply. So, the one thing that can be said for this executive order is that they are not trying to hide the ball on this. They are being very clear about their intent, and that is to maximize logging and timber production. Usually, when you see bad policies come out, they're hidden under the guise of forest health or wildfire resilience, as is the case with Fix Our Forests Act. But this was very clear on what it was trying to do. Next slide. So the agencies were directed to take action to undermine NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act to facilitate logging. These are some of our most critical bedrock environmental laws. They must issue guidance to boost logging and propose legislation to expand logging authority. They need to develop a strategy to speed up Endangered Species Act review for logging projects. And they must propose annual timber targets, increased timber targets. They must also consider adopting categorical exclusions that other agencies have adopted. So this has already happened. Federal agencies can adopt each other's categorical exclusions. And they must consider adopting NEPA exemptions for thinning and salvage logging, because we don't see enough of that already. Next slide. The agencies are generally directed to eliminate any existing policy that creates an undue burden on logging. So undue burden is not defined. So really it's anything that they find remotely inconvenient. Next slide. They're directed to use emergency provisions to speed up Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act. This requires federal agencies to ensure that their actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered or threatened species. The Endangered Species Committee is directed to identify obstacles to logging and figure out how to boost logging. So, this committee is also commonly referred to as the God Squad because of its ability to essentially give permission to activities that will drive a species to extinction. The administration is basically setting up a scenario where it could declare that endangered species like coho salmon, northern spotted owls, and marbled murrelets will lose protections and be driven toward extinction in pursuit of logging. So it's not good. Next slide. So the only good thing that can really be said about this executive order is that it's shorter than the first one. Next slide. This executive order describes wood products as vital to national defense. It asserts other countries are dumping lumber on the United States, and it establishes a policy of ensuring a secure domestic timber supply. All right, next slide, please. So, in summary, these executive orders blatantly prioritize industrial logging over other uses and values on our public forest lands, and it manufactures a national security crisis to justify it. It directs federal agencies to find ways to weaken key environmental protections under NEPA and the ESA, directly attacking our bedrock environmental laws. So, these executive orders were followed by a few other directives from the agencies, including a memo from Secretary Rawlins. This seeks to use emergency rationale to ramp up logging, asserts that the U.S. Forest Service needs to only analyze the proposed action and no alternative for actions falling under the emergency determination. So the Rawlins memo specifically also establishes an emergency situation determination across 113 million acres, so it can fast track logging in these areas. And the memo reiterates the directives from the EO, which call for using emergency ESA consultation provisions. So still going after bedrock environmental laws. Next slide. It directs another directive, directs the deputy chief to release direction for using emergency NEPA, emergency ESA, and other regulatory authorities to streamline and simplify permitting. It calls for developing a national strategy that outlines Forest Service goals, objectives, initial actions related to increased logging. We haven't seen this yet. And then it directs all regional foresters to develop 5-year strategies to increase their timber volume, leading to an agency-wide increase of 25% in timber production over the next 4 to 5 years. And all of these various processes are also happening kind of behind the scenes. They're not being disclosed to the public, so it's hard to know how far they are along in this process. But we definitely know that they are up to no good. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on the bad forest provisions in the big ugly bill that just passed because this presentation is focused on federal forests. But I want to acknowledge first how incredibly evil this law is. It will certainly do immeasurable harm to vulnerable people and communities across the country, and it's deeply disturbing that this bill is passed, and it's hard to process. A bit of good news first. We stopped the public land sell-off. So this was one of the first really big wins we've had in this community. Millions of acres were on the line. There was a groundswell of resistance from across the political spectrum and really kind of demonstrated a model of how we can successfully push back by organizing on the Trump administration. So I want to start with that piece at least. Next slide. So, one of the worst provisions of this bill is that it increases timber production by a minimum of 250 million board feet for the Forest Service and 20 million board feet for the Bureau of Land Management. This is a big increase, a big mandate. It's unclear how they're going to be able to meet this mandate, but it is in law and it has passed. This increase in logging will occur regardless of the impacts it could cause, whether that's worsening wildfires or clear cutting or impacting the climate and clean water benefits of our forests. Next slide. This bill also calls for ramping up logging across federal forests by requiring Forest Service and BLM to enter into at least one long-term timber contract per year for 10 years in each region. So these are 20-year logging contracts. A similar provision applies to the Bureau of Land Management, like I mentioned. So this might force harmful logging to occur that has negative impacts on drinking water, vulnerable wildlife, and mature and old growth forests. And it's important to note that these federal policies did not leave BLM lands out of it. So it wasn't just focused on national forests. And when it comes to logging on BLM lands, Oregon is pretty much ground zero because we are one of the only states, few states that has mature and old growth forests on our BLM lands and has active logging. So this is a big deal for Oregon specifically. Next slide. So another really important big picture consideration is that as all of these awful new policies are unfolding, our federal agencies are really not in great shape. So the Trump administration, Doge, Elon Musk have absolutely decimated our federal workforce in the United States. We often have disagreements with the Forest Service and BLM when it comes to logging on public lands. But the reality is that our public lands need these institutions and will be worse off without the thousands of public lands employees and experts who cared for and managed these lands. So we've lost scientific expertise, institutional knowledge, and specific knowledge of really unique local ecosystems and communities across the country with all of these thousands of staff that have been fired or are set up to be fired in the future. Next slide. So the final consideration that I want to leave with you all as we're thinking about this big picture before we go into the Fix Our Forests Act is what is all of this pointing to? We have these alarming executive orders, we have logging mandates that have passed, we have a full-on attack and gutting of our federal workforce. So when we think about privatizing public lands, the first thing that comes to a lot of people's mind is the idea of selling public lands, like we saw in the budget bill. It's the idea of just unloading them and selling them to private corporations. And this is definitely still a risk. Senator Lee will absolutely try this again in the future. But there's another threat that we need to keep an eye on, and that is privatizing the management of our public lands. So with these massive logging mandates and federal agencies in disarray, we expect the Trump administration to turn to contracts with private logging companies and attempt to cut the public out of all oversight of management decisions. And so this is something that will require people paying attention, getting organized, staying engaged going forward because we know that this is going to happen. It has started to happen. And as all of these policies hit the road and start moving forward, things are going to happen quickly with very little public notice. And that's everything for my section of the presentation. I do want to close with one action item. I saw Madeline sent around a list or an email to the list about organizing for local groves and organizing with your communities. And I would really encourage folks to get involved because taking things to the local level and organizing with people you know is one of the best ways to stay positive and engaged during these times. With that, I'll hand it over to Leah and Katie to talk about the Fix Our Forest Act, which luckily you still can take action on.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was awesome.
Yeah,
Uh,
thanks, Lauren.
Depressing, unfortunately, but really great explanation of all of that. For Katie and I, we're going to be kind of chatting back and forth for this section, so definitely bringing in the conversational style a bit here. But we really wanted to talk about the Fix Our Forest Act, which I know we've been talking a lot about, and then things got kind of quiet on it as the budget bill came into play, and now we are back. Now that the budget bill has gone through, we know that this will be coming back up again, but we're not exactly sure on the timeline. We think sometime during fire season. So definitely a great time to be aware of what it is so that we can fight back against it and share some information on what that looks like in this moment. So can you start here? The slide that's up right now, just for comparison, I know we were just talking about the executive orders, but the Fix Our Forest Act accomplishes many of the same things. So a lot of this is different things from different angles trying to achieve the same end goals. And this kind of shows how similar these really are in terms of the effects of Fix Our Forest and those executive orders. And the first slide kind of gives away a lot of what we will be talking about, but there's some main themes here that are why it's harmful.
Yeah, I think we wanted to give you guys kind of a takeaway and, first to remind you that the science isn't on the side of supporting grazing or logging. This isn't going to solve the issue. We want you to kind of have an understanding of how the big categorical exclusions are coming into play with fire shed assessments, the Endangered Species Act consultation bit that's in the bill, and the judicial review.
Absolutely. So to start us off here, obviously, I think we're all aware now that the Fix Our Forest Act is a terrible misnomer. So fighting back against that is honestly a huge part of this. I think a lot of times people just hear the name and make a lot of decisions about how they think about a thing. The Fix Our Forest Act really purports to protect communities from wildfires through logging. And we know that that's just not logging and grazing. And we know that that's just not the most effective way to do that. In fact, it can have the opposite effect and really put these communities at more risk. What we do know, the good science is for protecting communities is more of what's on this slide here. It's things within 150 feet of the home. It's community protection measures. These are the things that actually do help. And I wanted Lauren or Katie, I know you have
Yeah,
thoughts on grazing particularly too, and how that can be an issue. I know we've talked a lot more about kind of how
right.
proper timber can be an issue here too, but this bill also affects grazing.
Right. So kind of the structure of this bill, if folks remember way back to 2003, much simpler times, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act passed, and the way that that was structured is it gave the federal agencies a chance to designate certain areas for treatments, and then it laid out kind of these categorical exclusions that you could apply in the treatment areas. And really, kind of the mechanisms behind the Fix Our Forest Act are very similar to that. Instead of treatment areas, like they have fire shed assessments, and uh, and it basically so it designates these fire shed assessments and then allows like gigantic categorical exclusions that we'll talk about based on those fire shed assessments. But the thing I really wanted to hit home, like we can go down a hole in terms of talking about like fire and forests. And I know there are some tools coming out with the Alliance wildfire group on wildfire messaging. And I know this group is probably, there are probably some in this group really well versed. And if there aren't, like there are materials, and we'd be happy to give you materials so you can kind of see the science of fire and forests. But I wanted to take a really quick second to kind of talk about grazing, because I think when we talk about the Fix Our Forests Act, there we overlook the grazing aspect of this. And the grazing, so grazing, it's associated with erosion, water quality issues, displacing native species, and even sometimes to their peril. And it does not reduce wildfire. So especially out west in some of the step ecosystems that we have, there's something called a biocrust, and it's a living organismal layer that coats the soil in these semi-arid regions. And it makes it more difficult for invasive species to establish and grow. And so what I wanted to show you here is this graphic that talks about how cows come in and they eat the native grasses and they rip up like the biocrust. And what happens when this biocrust rips up and the native grasses are gone, our invasives can take hold. And these invasives include things like cheatgrass. And cheatgrass, with their shallow root system, they outcompete the native grasses on bare open soil that cattle provide. And cheatgrass dies about 6 weeks after growth and becomes highly flammable after that. So more cows in more grazing are going to equal more flammable cheatgrass lands. And I wanted to say that because there's a special provision um, amongst some of the I can't remember what they're called, like the fire treatment prescriptions that are in the Fix Our Forest Act. One of them is dedicated to grazing on this false premise that grazing will reduce wildfire risk. And so in that, like this bill kind of allows variances from the current grazing permits and treats grazing as like a fuel reduction strategy, what is absolutely not, and puts cows elsewhere based on this kind of flexible variances for grazing, like variances for grazing permits on these fire sheds with absolutely no NEPA and no public review. And this includes the categorical exclusions that we're going to talk about. And this is important because, you know, even with some of these areas, if there are areas that we consider more protected, like roadless areas or wilderness areas that happen to be outside this like ranking that allows for categorical exclusions, I want you guys to remember that, like this bill would allow these variances for grazing, and grazing is allowed in wilderness areas and it's allowed in roadless areas as well. So it really does impact some of our most protected lands, and it impacts it in a way that just kind of takes almost all the rules away for grazing. So this could mean cows could be in any place on the fireshed map with like no real review or public input. And these places could include trailheads, municipal watersheds, or other easily accessible areas that have otherwise been off limits to grazing. So now that we're going to be talking about categorical exclusions, I want to turn this back over to Leah.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of alluded to it a fair amount, so it'd be great to kind of get into it. Uh,
Great.
the categorical exclusions are, oh, here's a great, I'll leave up this map of the fireshed management areas because we were talking about
Yeah,
this as well.
yeah, and before I let you go with the
Yeah.
categorical exclusion, something to note is like so when I was reading the bill, these are the only two maps I could find that the bill references as kind of a starting point. And like that's the size of the map. Nothing is in greater detail. And I'm pretty sure one part of the bill it referenced this map on the right-hand side, but it's a different year. And so I think it was a typo in the bill, but I'm not totally sure. And so with that, yeah, let's continue the talk about categorical exclusions. What can you tell us about them, Leah?
Absolutely. Ooh, that's so the categorical exclusions create this way of fast tracking projects. We hear it come up quite a bit. And the rationale behind fast tracking these projects is that the effects of these projects would be so minimal that it doesn't require this analysis. What this bill does is it takes those categorical exclusions, which have already existed in similar ways recently, but they were at 2,500 acres, and would raise that maximum to 10,000 acres. So 4 times the size in just these massive projects. And the kind of analysis that it allows to be like skipped or deferred is really core things. It's like National Environmental Policy Act analysis, known as NEPA. It's National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, and also the Endangered Species Act. So you could be having these things affecting environmental issues. They could affect cultural sites. They could affect endangered species. And it also takes away the tribal consultation process with that as well. So it just really limits like the amount of analysis that's being done before these projects in the name of expediency, and along the way we can cause a lot of damage. And I kind of wanted to hear a bit more. I'd heard you explain before sort of the history of these CEs and thought that was fascinating. If you could kind of give us the version of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so categorical exclusions were originally an administrative creation, and they were created because, the agencies, and this made total sense, like the agencies didn't want paperwork ha to have to undergo a National Environmental Policy Act review for mowing a lawn at a ranger station, or applying herbicides at the ranger station, or replacing a roof on a shed, or this stuff that is absolutely not going to have an environmental impact. And what has happened over the years since like the idea of categorical exclusions were first put in place, as they've gotten like larger and larger, just gradually, like the agencies have made them larger and larger, and sometimes environmentalists can take them to court and kind of like stop the enlargement of them. But I would say that's been creeping for a long time. And then I think like honestly, I think it was a Healthy Forest Restoration Act, but don't totally quote me on that. I think the Healthy Forest Restoration Act cracked this open, and they took this administrative creation that was by, agencies that supposedly have the technical expertise to decide what is going to have an impact or not. And Congress just took it and made it a legislative CE. So like, and now what like the expansions that Leo was talking about, these are a lot of the categorical exclusions actually started in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and it just cracks them open much bigger, and in a legislative way where it's not because it doesn't have an environmental impact, but it's just because Congress is saying we're going to say it doesn't have an environmental impact, just like, we're going to say wolves are not endangered. It's like you can say that. The science doesn't support that, of course. But yeah, so like this is where we are now, is we have this world of categorical exclusions that Congress is creating.
I think I'm gonna butcher a Neil deGrasse Tyson quote, but isn't it science is true whether or not you believe it's true? I always appreciated that. Made me think of it.
That's a really good quote.
But yeah, so there's just the amount of potential damage that could be done there, I think is what's really striking to me. Even at the 2,500 acres, there was already definitely that risk, and now to just quadruple that size, especially in a time where everything else is being changed to try to ramp up timber production, just we're talking about like a huge uptick in speed at which these projects are considered and carried out. So that's definitely a concern.
Yeah.
The second kind of major, I guess third, we're going to count, it doesn't make
Yeah.
forest fires, it makes them worse as one. And then we have
Right, right.
these
We're
categorical exclusions
two
as
into our
two.
four takeaways, I think. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
So in that case, number three, on my mind is always the quote unquote cottonwood fix. This
Right.
is a provision that would remove the requirement for the Forest Service to consult with Fish and Wildlife when new information about endangered species comes out, and to like re-update forest plans that are already existing based on that information. So like if there's a forest plan in place, and then we discover that there's an endangered species in that area being affected by these things, irregardless of that, there would be no new consultation, and these projects could continue in a way that would harm these species. Is that understanding correct, Katie?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good restatement of it. I mean, I think when the audience hears Cottonwood, sometimes it's called a Cottonwood fix or the Cottonwood case. And what this was a case, I think over a decade ago now, where so it was based on it was actually based on a reconsultation lawsuit on lynx. And so what had happened was lynx got listed about 6 years later. They got critical habitat, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found I think like according to the court case, it looked like it was an insider job, like artificially deflating the number of acres in the Northern Rockies that end up as critical habitat. So what the Fish and Wildlife Service did is they revised the critical habitat, and they revised it from like 1,800 acres up to 10,000 acres. And the Forest Service, and before it didn't include forest system land, but after it did. And the Forest Service was like, we don't need to reconsult on this. And they got sued. And the Ninth Circuit said, yeah, you do. Like, reconsulting on forest plans is a continual obligation. And ever since that decision, like the people who don't like that, who I'd say mostly are Republicans, although this is confusing for me because, the Senate bill was a quote bipartisan bill with like two Democratic senators like signing on to this. But mostly, like what has come up in these different, like, and this has happened over the Farm Bill, is the people with money that didn't like that decision have been like, they've been chipping away at it. And so, like, one of the chips that got through one of the farm bills was like, okay, well, you don't have to reconsult on forest plans unless they're, I think it was like 10 years old or something like that. And like what this does is just eliminate that entirely. So it doesn't matter how old the forest plan is. And it's really important that you have this kind of continual obligation. So,
Yeah, I just think that's fascinating. That like we'll learn new things, but we won't have to do anything about it is
great.
a dismal view to take. So definitely a large concern there. You had mentioned a story to do with the Nez Perce tribe as well around this. Is that something you want to touch on?
Um, yeah, I mean, like, if like this might be already a little out of date because I think the Nez Perce and Clearwater National Forests have already amended their forest plan, but um, like 2 years ago or something, that forest plan was like 30 years old. And what this section kind of does is it would take away any continuing duty to reconsult on even a 30-year-old forest plan as opposed to a 10-year-old forest plan. And I think that's the point I was making, forgetting that they've already come out with a new decision and a new forest plan, which is, subpar.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a ton of
Good
sense.
way to talk about it. So,
But
yeah. And so, let's see. Let me see here. So just for the references of the people at home, like if you look, so the Senate bill that is the Fix Our Forest Act, that is Senate Bill 1462 in this Congress, which is the 119th Congress. And so if you're curious as to some of these, like the categorical exclusions, most of them are in section 106. The ESA and forest plan consultation bit, that's in section 122. And I think the last thing we really kind of wanted to hit on before we turn to a hopeful thing, before people finish their evening, is the judicial review. And this is where actually some of the bill has changed a little, but like it hasn't changed in a good way. Um, so, Fix Our Force Act, it kind of reduces and limits judicial review. It tells courts like what the court needs to consider as important. It increases like so under the current law, under the administrative, well, actually, sorry, the statute of limitations for taking environmental cases, you have 6 years. And the version of the Fix Our Force Act that the House passed said 120 days. You have 120 days to bring a lawsuit. And the two Democratic senators got involved. Now we have 150 days. So it's like from 4 months to 5 months instead of, the current 6-year window that we have. And that is, it's important to understand that even the areas that are protected, and even if this is just a blatant violation of even the Fix Our Forest Act, this judicial review is going to impact that. So let's say, in many instances, grazing aside, in many instances, these categorical exclusions, like they exclude wilderness areas. But if the Forest Service just included a wilderness area when they're doing a categorical exclusion, it doesn't matter, it's blatantly unlawful. Under this, like, organizations like Wilderness Watch or anyone else interested in defending wilderness would still have only 5 months to find a lawyer and develop a case and file a lawsuit. So it is really not that much time. Um, it also, let's see. Ugh, let me think. The other big one it has, like, so we have the Senate version because And this is, I think, a testament to everybody working together and kind of the public outcry. I mean, this will kind of get to the hopeful stuff later, but I think what happened in terms of us getting a different Fix Our Forest Act bill in the Senate than the House, because the Senate actually considered the House and they had a hearing on the House bill. I think enough people contacted their elected officials that the officials like everybody was kind of they were very like reluctant to vote for it. And so this is where this like Senate bill came out. But, some of the things that folks testified on in this in this first hearing in the House version of the Fix Our Forest Act is this lack of public review. And the Senate bill adds or lack of public participation. And the Senate bill adds public participation, but doesn't really add it in a way that is meaningful. Like when you have a right, it's only as good as whether you can enforce it or not. And so some of these, what is new in the Senate bill is a comment period for the fire shed assessments. But the fire shed assessments still aren't reviewable under NEPA. So you can give them all the science you want, but the science that the Forest Service is going to deem the best available science is just their opinion, and it's not challengeable. And so you know, it it kind of has these like comment periods like baked in. They're almost like feel good comment periods because there's no real accountability for not listening to the public. And I think that's really important for folks to understand, especially like when, senators come back and they say, well, you have a chance to comment. It's like, well, it doesn't really count if like you can't do anything with that comment and the Forest Service is going to ignore you anyway. So,
Yeah, I know you mentioned a couple of times just the idea of like this takes away our voices in this process. And I think that's something really important to note here and to make sure that people know. It takes away the voices of communities. It takes away the voices of people who interact with these places, whether they live near them or are coming from further to recreate or enjoy them. And just like it takes away our ability to protect them, which is so central. And I think for a lot of people on this call as well is something that we've been engaging with for so long, and losing access to those mechanisms would be just such a huge detriment. So now is the time to be loud about this for sure, while we still have more sway over it instead of trying to work through the processes of it afterwards.
right. And kind of the hopeful part, I think, of what to do. And, I just mentioned, well, that's a little too far in the field of hope. We're going to go back to the call to action kind of hope. But so all the Republicans need are 7 Democratic votes. Like they do need to pass this by 60 votes. And so I guess like our call to action is to actually call your senator. I think I suspect it makes a bigger difference because they have to actually put the face-to-face time of like interacting with you on the phone as opposed to just filing your email away. Um, and let me see what else I was going to say. Oh, kind of harking back to what I just mentioned on, so the Fix Our Forest Act, when the House passed it, it went to the Senate, and the Agriculture Committee had a hearing on it. And I think enough people called and expressed concern with their senators that it wasn't going to get to the vote and because everybody was worried about going straight to the floor kind of for a vote and getting passed. But I think enough people raised enough concern. And we see what happens when there's like gigantic public outrage, like the public lands bill, like the Democrats and like I'm not saying it was just like the public lands bill, but like the Democrats kind of voted in a block. And so making them understand, I think how important this is, how this doesn't protect roadless areas, it doesn't protect wilderness areas, it doesn't protect wildlife. I think it's possible to stop those 7 like Democratic votes. And the intel I've had is that Bennett, who is on the agriculture, I think it's the agriculture subcommittee that's considering this, so Hickenlooper and Senator Hickenlooper out of Colorado and Senator Padilla out of California, they're the two senators that have made it bipartisan. Like this was the bill that they co-sponsored and introduced with their Republican colleagues. But Bennett is on the fence. I understand that Bennett is on the fence, and if he says yes, like there is a higher likelihood that these seven hypothetical Democratic votes would follow that. And so I think like if you have friends in Colorado or if you're tuning in from Colorado, call Bennett's office and tell them not to support this bill. So, yeah. Yeah, and then also like Leah and I both have probably like talking points that grazing that sorry, the grazing graphic I showed you earlier is part of a grazing fact sheet that Wilderness Watch has kind of collaborated with the Healthy Public Lands the Healthy Public Lands Project um, Coalition and Western Watersheds, and like we have not put our name or brand on it because like we want folks to be able to use this widely. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out to me and I can send you that. Yeah, and do you have anything to add about that, Leah, before we like talk about the other hope?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have also great fact sheets as well, more on the forest side. So
Great.
happy to provide those. I'm sure we'll include some materials as well with the follow-up email here. I think one note I would say is if you're thinking of any questions you have for us, maybe start writing those out now so that we can get to those in a minute here. And then just, yeah, really reiterating, I think this bill, when it originally got reintroduced this year, it was right after the LA fires. There was just a lot of energy around like we have to do something about this, and I think
Great.
that put a lot of pressure on a lot of Democrats. So when it came through the House, it got votes we normally wouldn't have expected. I think
Right.
people are a little more savvy to what this actually means now, but there's still a lot of pressure. And we anticipate that this may be kind of held until wildfire season and when that pressure is back on again. So really showing your representatives that like they have that backing if they that their constituency understands that this is not a way to protect them from wildfire risk is extremely important, regardless of whether your senator is Republican or Democrat. I think it's really great to reiterate that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I have a colleague who went to different representative offices in California, and they sat down and they explained to the staff how like this is not going to like protect people, and the staff and those representatives were like, yeah, we know, but like we have to look like we're doing something, which like I think just floored my colleague. And when she told me that, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. So. I definitely agree with what you said, Leah. Like giving, trying to persuade the elected officials who like might not understand, and for the ones who do understand, giving them the cover and showing them that their constituents understand their vote and will support them. And I think we were asked to kind of talk or like at least mention the interplay between, the Fix Our Forest Act and all the NEPA changes we've seen and the kind of rescinding of the roadless rule. Um, do you want to start with thoughts on that, Leah?
Yeah, my thoughts here are honestly pretty broad still. A lot of these things, because they haven't been brought to reality yet, and there's like details on how they'll exactly be put into place or enforced, we don't honestly know how they're all going to layer. We just know that they'll amplify each other and that that will be bad. Like frankly, trying to stop these things now is really the way to do it because the exact effects of what that's all going to look like when it's layered together and like processes are expedited and areas are opened to new things and contracts are put into place. Just all of this together has so much potential to amplify in my mind that it's really just like a let's do everything we can to not end up there because it's unclear. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, we don't know what's going to happen because of these like multiple layers from kind of all sides. And I do think the ground is kind of shifting beneath our feet in a way that like the folks living for like many in this generation have never experienced before. But I also think it's important that when we get a chance to build back, that we don't build back to just a crappy status quo. And I would argue that we've like the environmental movement and the environmental laws have been sliding for many decades, and it's because we passed it and we're like, yeah, this is a win. And then, the money and the motivation, like the motivation and money given time is this really corrosive force. And I think it's chipped away at the National Environmental Policy Act. I think it's chipped away at the Endangered Species Act. I think it's, even chipped away a little bit at the Wilderness Act. And so it's important to when we build it back, not to build it back to where we are now, but to build it back to something like way, way better, something even maybe better than was in like the 60s and 70s when like a lot of these environmental statutes were passed. So, Alex, was there a question about wilderness? Did I see like a
Yeah.
question kind of pop up? Okay.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions. One specifically from Paul was, is there a list of specific wilderness areas that are we anticipate being targeted for thinning or logging
Um,
projects as a result of
it's
this?
It's really hard to tell because the maps that you're looking at on the screen is the same information we have. And so, like, all we can do is kind of like take these little pixels and overlay them with wilderness areas. But it looks like several wilderness areas in the west. And that's not, I'm not entirely sure if it would be thinning. It would have to line up. I think like a lot of things would have to line up for that. But, like, this is part of the problem with the fire shed assessment, right? Is like this is what you're looking at is the information we have about fire shed assessments, and we don't get more information in a way that we can't meaningfully participate. Whereas now, like this is kind of the meaningful participation that we have is before FOPA passes. So,
Yeah, I would back that up as well. I feel like the things that we hear about like what this is actually stating it will do at this point is like, oh, it's not about wilderness areas, it's about these other areas. But then all of the actual data that's been provided is so rough. It's kind of like the public land sale where it's like that's the boundary waters. And just the mapping on it was really rough and shoddily done. And it's hard to trust in a process that is so untransparent because everything is so undefined. It's very much the opposite of like a carefully done science-backed vision of a thing.
right. Yeah. That was an excellent add-on. I appreciated that. Should we, where did, Alex, did you see other question or should we just end with a bright spot and then open the floor to every question?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The like chat, the normal chat is turned off, so folks have to put their questions in the Q&A, and that's where you'll see them. I think the other thing someone asked is just like, how do we respond to this? And I mean, you've touched on that a little bit. It sounds like, in particular, reaching out to representatives and senators, especially the Colorado delegation from the Senate, but even folks who aren't some of those like key votes, and just putting
Right.
pressure on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now the pressure's got to go onto the elected representatives. And like, I don't, to be fair, I think there are Democratic senators that would follow Bennett if Bennett supported this. But also, Wyden's not great. Like he's your senator. He's the senator. I shouldn't say your senator. I don't live in Oregon. He's the senator in Oregon, and he is not great on forestry issues. Am I correct in that assessment? So like he'd be a good one to lean on because he seems like someone who he could be one of those seven Democratic votes that they need, right? And so I think it's important that he hears from his constituents. And if you lean on a Republican, you get a Republican over, like great. Like some of them with enough public pressure, like some of them actually, you know, I don't I don't think they changed their votes, but like they came out, even the Idaho senators came out with these statements of public or statements of opposition to public land sales. Did it mean like they were not going to vote for the bill if it were in there? Who knows? They didn't draw the line in the sand like the Montana delegation did, but like I think it was pretty big even that they came like they acknowledged that they were getting so much pushback from their constituents. So,
Yeah, and
uh, yeah.
if you feel like you're like I've gotten in touch with all of my senators. I've gotten in touch with my friends and asked them to get in touch with their senators. I feel like the next step with Fix Our Forests especially is just like trying to spread that education component
Right.
about what this actually is and what it actually does.
Right.
Spreading that as broadly as we can, whether that's with social media or letters to the editor or just like conversations with people in our communities,
Right.
especially community leaders. If you know any county commissioners, it's a great time to call them up and have a chat and see if they might talk about it publicly. But really, just I think fighting the misinformation around it. There are also groups like Fusey who do a lot of work, kind of our wildland fire practitioners, practitioners of, sorry, they've worked in wildland fire. They are prescribed burn practitioners. But have a lot of expertise and knowledge around wild and fire, and also are coming out and doing a lot of work to educate people on like this is not the way that we actually protect our communities. And I think helping amplify voices like that, like from trusted parties, is also an effective way to get the word out around this. It's just so much misinformation based.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. Those are all really good tips. So
And I
shall
think
we?
on that point of what you were just saying, Katie, about that story about this congressperson staff saying like, well, we have to look like we're doing something. We know it's not going to
Right.
work. I think the more people can speak up and say, here's what we do want you to do. It's
Right.
actual funding for things like home retrofits and hardening and defensible space and evacuation routes so that they hear that that's what people actually want.
And that's
Right.
totally worth the plug as well, is that Fix Our Forest Act kind of name drops a lot of those things as well, and none of those are funded. So it's an ultimate slap in the face for kind of the actual effective ways to keep these places safe.
And there are a couple of bills. There's one that's better than the other in the House that talk about, funding for creating defensible space around homes. That was not something I looked up before I came, so I can't like rattle the Oh, do you have it?
Yeah,
Oh, sweet. Nice.
I
Nice work. Way to be prepared.
keep going then.
Oh yeah, so yeah, there are a couple other bills in the House that, do address. So like bills are there to like solve a perceived problem, right? And like the perceived problem that the Fix Our Forest Act is purporting to solve is trying to make communities safer from wildfire, whether it's evacuation routes, whether it's around the community. And like this is where, we're like the solution isn't logging, it's not grazing, it's making buildings more fireproof because in the end, a fireproof like buildings that are firewised and like kind of prepped for this can survive high severity fires. But if like we don't do that education, those buildings could be lost in low severity fires. It doesn't matter because if you have debris on the roof and you have like cedar shake roofs, it doesn't take it just doesn't take that much to light a house on fire in terms of like being close to a wildfire, and it doesn't need to be a high severity wildfire. It can be a low severity one.
Yeah, and also it was Representative Huffman's Community Protection and Wildfire Resilience
Right.
Act was the one that I had as my kind of number one. This would be better if we could get this
Yeah.
alternative.
No, absolutely. I agree with that.
Mhm. I did see a number of questions that were like, we can't type in the chat, so my apologies. It's kind of just the way the webinar setup works as opposed to the smaller scale. But there is a FAQ button at the bottom or a Q&A, sorry, where you can submit questions and we can see them. So please feel free to use that.
And as they're doing that, should we finish with the bright spot
Oh, let's do
of
it. Mhm.
So we had a request to end with a bright spot in Congress, and those are few and far between now. But they do exist in a couple of places. And so one of the plugs I want to make is for the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act. It has been introduced to both the House and the Senate. And this is what it does is it's based kind of around increasing the protection of bioregions and their connecting corridors. And so you see like five major bioregions across like I think all the states in the Pacific Northwest, really. You see the Greater Yellowstone, which is down kind of on like the where it says Yellowstone National Park. I guess I can't really circle that stuff or put a laser on it or anything. But to the west of that, in Idaho, then you have the Greater Salmon Selway ecosystem. On the north part up in Montana, where you see Glacier National Park, that is the Glacier Northern Continental Divide. And then in northern Idaho, you see the Cabinet or the Greater Cabinet Yaak ecosystem. Yeah, it's kind of near the very western Montana, north Idaho. And then in eastern Oregon, you have the Greater Hells Canyon, Wallowa, bioregion. I think I covered five there. So, anyways, the overview of the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act is that it designates about 1,800 miles of rivers under the Wild Scenic River. It takes 20.5 million acres of roadless areas. So, um, to kind of back up as you're looking at this map, because I those are pretty like it's pretty sm a pretty small legend. The dark green is the current wilderness areas. The brown are national parks. So the bright green is the 20.5 million acres of roadless areas that this bill would designate with the highest level of legal protection we can give public lands, which is wilderness under the 1964 Wilderness Act. It also establishes, and these are harder to see, but if you like kind of look between these areas, it looks kind of like these little shaded like fingers reaching into these areas. And what that is a 3.5 million acre system of biological linkage corridors that have special management connections that connect these bioregions. So it connects it to a functioning ecological whole. So and in these like little arm like finger links to these different bioregions, where wilderness is an appropriate designation, wilderness gets designated, so you see kind of some of those bright green in there. But wilderness isn't an appropriate designation. They're special management zones where development is not prohibited, but it's limited in some way. And finally, the red areas are kind of a pilot system of wildland restoration that tries to do things like remove unneeded roads, reduce soil erosion, and restore native vegetation and water quality. So if your elected representative is not on this, and maybe they care about roadless areas, this passing this is a surefire way to protect it. And I do understand that is like a million and one kind of long shot in this Congress. But all of these, a lot of the bills that we know, like the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act or the Wilderness Act, they were introduced to multiple Congresses. So, it's important that I think even sponsoring it gets its support, which gets it a little further in the next round and in the next Congress. So even like having your encouraging your elected representative to co-sponsor it in this Congress is still important. So I think those are all our takeaways, right? Leah, uh, should we open the floor to questions?
Yeah, we are coming up kind of closer to time as well here, so
Yeah,
uh, maybe keeping it relatively short. Man, there's a strong question in here that's like, are we rallying people around this? And I think that sort of spoke to me because this is in my mind, this is part of that. And I just want to reiterate, I know this is not the best format for feeling like you're part of a community on a webinar because
right,
you can't see how many other people are on here, but there's like
right.
40 plus people on here coming together because they care about this to listen to this right now. And like there's a number of venues. We can share some of those as well in the follow-up email for like continuing to get involved if you're on the list or if you're already there. But just like this is the community, and we need to rally together. There's not a other hidden community, I guess is my point here. Like, we are our community, and the more we can show up for each other and come together around this, the better. Like, it starts here. And there are other venues like this. Don't get me wrong. We're shouting over the hilltops everywhere we can about these things, and we've got all kinds of people doing all kinds of work on it. But you're the community, and that's both empowering and scary, I think sometimes. But this is the welcome in. Like any more momentum is always welcome, and I'm stoked to have so many people here who care.
If folks have other questions you want to drop in the chat, we have time for a couple more. Otherwise, Leah or Katie, are there any like organizations, social media channels, or things that you recommend folks follow to stay up to date? Obviously, we'll be sending out some follow-up materials and links and more resources, but other places folks should follow or stay tuned to for more information as this progresses.
For more information on the Fix Our Forest Act, I'd
Yeah.
imagine Wilderness Watch will probably be sending out more action alerts on the Fix Our Forest Act as information becomes available. So we're a good one to follow.
Yeah, at Sierra Club as well. I mean, I personally am always gonna plug my own, but I have a regional call once a week, or actually every other week, where I share updates on just everything that's happening and kind of current actions to push back against that I can share information with as well. I think sometimes keeping up with the news on all of this can be a full-time job because it is my full-time job. And I would be more than happy to filter that for other people so that we can move more towards action instead of just getting exhausted by the chaos, because I think that's the plan and I don't want to let it work.
Right. Those are good tips.
And I liked the question about there's one that's like many groups in recent years were coming to terms with each other a bit better, and now it feels like there's a grenade and everyone's retreated to their corners. I am gonna take an opposite stance on that, actually. I feel like this has been a good rallying cry in some ways. We saw it with the public lands attacks, but the attacks right now are so blatant and so broad. We're a little less in the minutia of exactly what things should look like. We can all agree that this is horrific and come together around it. And I think we're starting to see that. And I would encourage continuing with that momentum. We're just so much stronger together on these things. And we all agree on this one, which is great. That's a great starting place for us to be in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that might do it for us tonight then. Unless y'all have anything else you want to add or share, Leah or Katie. Last chance to get your final questions in, everyone.
We're the how do we, I guess there's a last question to that last one too. For the how do we stay friends with our communities through this? The one thing I'd love to see more of is just let's all come together in person more. I feel like
Right.
it's hard to make happen. We need people in each place for that to happen. Like it's a smaller bubble, but I do think that's really deeply meaningful, especially when it comes to like how do we keep this is going to be a sustained effort. There's a number of years to go on all of this either way. So just like bringing that joy and community into it. So if you have the capacity to get something started in person around you, I would highly encourage that.
Right. And this is where kind of that we come full circle and go back to the groves, right? Because the groves are like that community connection point.
Hmm.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you, Katie and Leah and Lauren.
Thank you,
I did dip
Leah.
out
Thank you,
early.
Alex.
I
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah,
y'all.
thanks everyone for being here. We'll be in touch with next steps in the next couple webinars coming up
And
over the
recording.
next few months.
All right.
Yes,
Sweet.
that's right. Okay,
Take care, y'all.
Bye.
bye.